Any DJ too.
Oh, this room.
Oh, dude, I thought it was that room. Where's my bag? Upstairs. I think.
You want it or you want it?
No, I let them play in the hall. No, what the hell is this?
Bukan. Itu pendek, pendek.
You gonna.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Novice Semifinals. I'll just try to give details of it. But okay, so on the motion about Uganda, I would like to invite the Prime Minister and begin this meeting.
Yeah! Oh, Yeah, just turn it off. Turn it off, Canon.
Oh. We have to understand that Uganda is a state that criminalizes gays and all these kind of things. We think that the problem becomes even worse when even the France and US says that cut aid to them and say that no, what you're doing is extremely complicit. They still do those kind of things. That's the entire problem in today's case. That number one, homosexuals are extremely discriminated within society. Number two, that homosexuals who hold hands in public are considered a crime and immediately punished by any means. And number three, because of the continuous state legitimization of that particular complicit act, we think that people on the ground also follow those kind of precedents the states does. And it leads to mass amount of persecution of gay communities within Uganda. On our side, we attempt to stop those kind of things. What we're going to do is very simple. That number one, we're going to stop providing aid, which means we are cutting out all kind of funding to them in monetary means. Number two, we think that assuming that there's a spillover of harm, it harms other states, not Uganda. In those kind of situations, we think that the UN will intervene and provide peacekeepers in those kind of countries that are involved. We think that humanitarian aid to those kind of states is not a problem on our case today, because we only want to focus on Uganda. And number three, this is our burden also, that we're going to prove to you today that this aid is the only way to financially decriminalize homosexuals and integrate them within the society of Uganda itself. I'm going to prove to you three things today. That number one, why Uganda will take it as a paramount incentive. Number two, how people on the ground would be affected. And thirdly, without this policy, why it harms the entire UN's principle. But before I move on to that, any of your eyes?
So basically, you're trying to cut aid from France and US or cut aid from the bank?
We are going to cut off aid from UN. We just gave you an example of countries like France and US who cut off aid, but UN still provide them aid. What we're doing here is we're cutting aid completely to Uganda. Number one, why Uganda will take this as a paramount incentive? Because firstly, we have to understand the nature of the situation there. That Uganda is an extremely poor country, and a structure within the states function on the money in which UN provides them. We think that taking away those kind of funds also means imposing a direct threat to the atmosphere of their political sphere. We think that money, which is a fundamental need for Ugandan's government there, would be entirely cut off. We think that that's the best kind of aid we can do to change the situation there. But secondly, we also tell you that that USA and France has already retracted funding them. The reason why they did so is because they tell Uganda that, look, your kind of laws are very complicit against gay people. But the reason why Uganda still criminalize those kind of acts is simply because UN is still funding them. That's the main reason why they haven't decriminalized such kind of discriminatory laws. We think that Uganda would never change under this kind of scenario when they sit down, when they continue this kind of act, and we think that we have to make that change. On the third level, we have to understand Uganda's position, that they're directly tied to other kind of countries, such as the Central African Republic. They send troops for, for other economical benefit, which also means that our policy would never ever affect this kind of states. But even if this is argued that it will affect those kind of states related, we think that under our policy, UN will take the entire burden of stepping in and solving the entire problem. But fourthly, when people on the ground are being harmed, we think that government takes this as an incentive, a large incentive to change. Why is this so? Because we think that even though UN is imposing a top-down approach on this kind of country, it's still effective. It will still make people understand. We give you an example of Karo Kari in Pakistan, where the government there had a top-down approach to not allow honor killing between the people there itself. Even though it's a top-down approach, people shouldn't understand why is it so discriminatory to have any sort of honor killing. We think it's extremely justified from our side. Sit down. But moving on to my second argument, is why people on the ground would be affected. Because number one, we think that paramount scale is put onto them. We think that cutting off funds is not something easy and is direct imposition of threat towards the political atmosphere within Uganda itself. It's not a direct threat to individuals who are Ugandans, but it's a threat to all those politicians there who legitimize such kind of complicit act. We think that making politics change and understand would happen under our side. But secondly, we think that our side can force politicians to challenge their kind of views and ideologies, because we think that the politicians there are acting in a very complicit manner, where they still criminalize and discriminate this kind of gays. We think that under our policy, you make them change their kind of view, because aid is given by the UN to these kind of politicians. So the politicians use the money to actually serve the people in Uganda who needs that kind of money. When you cut that kind of monetary aid off, the politicians cannot serve their people. We think that when you force those kind of things, politicians would think again on why they can't help the people, and they'll think and force themselves to think again why, in order to help the people, they have to stop discriminating the gays. But on the third level, why when people stop receiving aid, it will change? Because people on the ground would understand that why gays are so important in the first place. We don't think it will cause hate to gays as a whole. Instead, the individuals in Uganda would instead hate their leaders for imposing such kind of complicit and discriminatory laws, and that the act of the government itself is causing them the severe sufferings they have to. But we think that even though people oppose the idea of gays, in some cases, if they want to if they want to push for it, we think that criminalizing that act in itself is something really unnecessary. Because when people are harmed, we think it puts government in a position to think again and to change its policies towards accepting and decriminalizing this kind of gay sexuality. On the third argument, why without this policy it harms the UN's principle? Because we have to understand UN's principle is a universal principle that everyone in the world has to follow to the laws that UN place. And one of the laws are laws against discrimination, that you have to accept every single individual. We think that you can never directly discriminate a group that deserves those kinds of rights. Those are the universal principles in which UN sets. But secondly, we think that when you continuously aid these kind of people, it becomes a legitimization of that complicit act in itself. Because we think that Uganda keep feeling their act is legitimized because the UN still funds them, even though their principles said you can't discriminate these kind of people. We think that they think that the discriminate act will be legitimized. We think it's even worse. But thirdly, we think that outside create a precedence of harm when other nation looks upon it as well. So let's say there's a post-conflict society or any other ordinary society. We think that they'll think that, look, we still can discriminate these kind of people because they're doing it in Uganda. We give you an example of Philippines where they will still do these kind of things and still discriminate these kind of homosexuals. We think that when they see that as a problem, it's worse. But fourthly, we think that it harmed the credibility of UN because UN loses credibility when it says that, look, these are our principles, but we still never stop you. We think that when it harms UN's credibility, it's bad for the UN. That's why we think we should imply this policy. For all those reasons, we are very proud to propose.
It was funny how Kenneth, even to his 7th minute and 34th second, wanted to fight for homosexuals. He gave us so much examples of how horrible their life is, and yet he believes that just by not giving people aid, they will suddenly change. We're going to tell you and contextualize to you properly why specifically in Uganda they never want to give up going against gays right now, and how they will never solve the problem. But before my few arguments to you, a few rebuttals. Number one, on politicians can never be serving people, and therefore these people would be likely to change. We think that No, politicians will never want to do so because merely they want to reflect social values that exist within the system. They want to be seen as politicians that like and agree to the social norms that exist on the ground, and that's why they will never want to concede to other values, right? But moreover, we think that even when Yoweri Museveni, the president of Uganda, wanted to make the consequences of being gay much lower in that situation, people still struck it down. People still rioted, and people still wanted it to be ultimately a life imprisonment if you were to be gay. So we think that even if politicians change it, you never change society on the ground. Society will still hate them. But under our case, we're going to tell you how you further hate them in that situation. No. Second idea, how UN is always against discrimination and how you're legitimizing it. No, we don't think so, right? Because number one, we think that the whole purpose of giving aid to someone is to eradicate poverty. That's the whole idea of giving aid. And the only situations in which UN or the World Bank or whoever imposes certain prerequisites to getting aid is when it affects how this money is being dispensed. That's why we tell you, that's why many times they force you to become a democracy, because that's how it affects how the money is dispensed. Not when certain discriminations and all those exist, because ultimately if they didn't like the idea of communism in Vietnam, they wouldn't have provided aid to Vietnam at all. So that ultimately still, so we don't think that UN is ultimately still against discrimination. But this last idea on UN's credibility, right, and how it harms them, we think we're going to rebut that to you in my first argument. But also on the idea of their whole idea how they want to change society's perception, we're going to tell you that how it doesn't work. My first argument, the purpose of aid and the objectives of goals. Because we tell you the purpose of aid is always to eradicate poverty as a whole. They always let's look at the comparison of rights in this situation. Would you prefer to give a primary right to people on the ground, especially if they characterize that Ugandan people are so poor and so hungry and living in poverty all the time, then the primary right that you always have to focus on is giving them food, giving them ability to live. You never sacrifice secondary rights to give primary rights. Because secondary rights, like rights to identify yourself as a homosexual, is a secondary right. You have to first be able to live before you can identify yourself. Sit down. But the other idea was this idea on UN, right? Because we think that it's harmful when you allow for UN to impose these certain things. Why? Because whichever country that dominates UN, and in this situation is US, right, gets to be able to change the values of another country in this situation. And we don't think any country has the ability to change values in other countries. But moreover, you think about the proper principles in US in itself. US only has 17 out of 51 states that actually legalize homosexuality. Homosexuality is still a controversial subject. So we don't think it's something that US or UN as a whole can ultimately promote when it's not something that is universally agreed on, right? So we don't think that they should set a universal standard on LGBT rights. But most of all, we think that you can never sacrifice primary rights for secondary rights. But number two, how the nature and crime of homosexuality in Uganda specifically harms homosexuals even more, but the eminent change is impossible. And this is rebutting the entire case on how it will change on the ground, right? Because we tell you, number one, you have to characterize and look at the real situations in Uganda. People are going out on a witch hunt in which they establish the top 200 gay people in order to kill them down on the street. That's how horrible the situation is. They're extremely conservative and extremely like to go towards their religious values and beliefs. Number one, proofs and examples, right? Number one, President Yoweri Museveni himself wanted to decriminalize it, wanted to make the consequences of being a gay less, and yet people on the ground rioted and wanted otherwise. This proves how society on the ground will never change even if your politician wants to change. But number two, the major donors to that country that contributes to 50% of that country's budget itself already threatened them, already pleaded for them to not have this right, and yet they still ignored it, yet they still went towards having those LGBT laws, right? And we think that this proves how stringent they are and how they are willing to sacrifice getting aid from the 50% budget that they are already getting in order to adhere to their social values and adhere to their religious beliefs. And that's how stringent they are. But lastly, the local media in that country itself, Madam Chair, makes anti-gay sentiments and links it towards nationalism. That means if you are proper Ugandan, you will never support LGBTs. If you are someone that supports LGBT, or if you yourself are LGBT himself, you are not a Ugandan. And that's extremely harmful to the psyche of the people on the ground. They will never begin to accept homosexuality. But how is it even more harmful to homosexuals yet?
Outside forces the politicians to change their policy. That's when you directly delegitimize
gay being criminalized.
Okay, but if you change the policies, people on the ground already rioted against it, number one. But even if you change policies, these people that believe that their national identity is against LGBT laws, their religion and their God tells them that LGBT is wrong, they will never begin to accept it under your paradigm. But how do you victimize them worse, Madam Chair? We think you exacerbate the harms to the LGBT community. Number one, people that live in poverty and a constant bad environment are retracted from any form of aid anymore. That means I don't get food on my table, and they will start to blame the LGBT people. Because if the LGBT people did not exist, then they would be still getting aid, they would be still getting food on the table. So ultimately you make them even more harmful, and you send the rhetoric that these people are the reason why they're starving even more. But secondly, we think it also harms the homosexual psyche himself, whereby people begin to tell them, people not only think that it's a sin for you to be that, but also people begin to tell them that they are the reason why everyone is hungry. And me as someone that believes she or he himself is a homosexual, would then resort to blaming themselves and start to think, should I be a homosexual or not? Because ultimately, because of my identity, I'm harming my community, I'm harming my family that doesn't get aid from UN or from whoever else. And we think that's extremely harmful to the psyche of the person themselves, whereby you disincentivize anyone from ever coming out of the closet. You make these LGBT's lives even more worse on the ground. When people not only have witch hands, then they probably have wizard hands in that situation. We think it's even more harmful towards LGBTs, but moreover, it's not what UN does, because UN does things to provide aid to people. We gave you examples like in Vietnam, whereby they still provided aid because the people on the ground needed it. In Ukraine, you still provide aid, even though Ukraine is not extremely liberalized and still have ties towards Russia, because they ultimately recognize that Russia should be that Ukraine should not have any ties with Russia anymore. So that's a lot of examples in which the UN or World Bank gives money towards people because to eradicate poverty and to always look at primary rights over secondary rights.
Okay. We totally understand that right now, and all the progress that didn't happen so far is because that the UN is still providing aid towards Uganda, right? Because sure, all that's happened so far about UN retracting aid and France retracting aid, and even the president trying to enforce the idea onto other people has not worked because the people themselves do not know what is the harm that can come towards them if they continue to do this, right? And there are a few harms that they never responded to that came out in Kenner's speech, right? On the first harm is that, one, the delegitimization of the UN in itself. Okay, what happens now, and this I'll further explain it to you, right, is that when you allow UN to do this and continue funding aid towards these people and legitimizing that the suppression of that right, you also tell all the other countries out there that yes, it's okay to continue suppressing the rights of minorities, right, and suppressing the rights of these people, right. And this is what they never understood, that you as the UN, as the overarching body of the whole world, if you legitimize this, means that you also tell all the other countries that yes, you know, it's okay to do this. We don't want this to happen in the first place, right? But let's go in, before I go into my substantive, how you reinforce the idea that gays should be a part of society, and secondly, how you force Uganda to be a more progressive state. Let's look at a few rebuttals, right? Firstly, on this idea that you cannot allow a secondary right to be to supersede your main right, right? Let's say right to food, a right to life, etc., etc. But the thing is, they are sacrificing the rights of these homosexuals in the first place, right? We think that when a country actively goes against and actively terminates and puts these people in life imprisonment and executes these people and goes on wizard hunts, right? We think that this is when you need to take away your legitimization of that case, right? Because why is this so problematic under their stance, right? Because taking away food and taking away aid isn't necessarily mean that a person is going to die straight away, right? That a country can still find those aid. But when you put that country into that position, right,
where they need to go through all this, where the people in themselves are going through all this, right, looking for food, we think that this is when people will try to rationalize and see that yes, if we do continue to suppress the rights of these gays, we cannot continue to survive, right? And because obviously what can happen is this, right? When the gays, when these people know that the UN will give them back that aid and will give them back more aid if they decriminalize gays, this enforces the idea and entrenches their mind that, you know, maybe I should support gays, right? Because if I don't, my country is going to be in a bad shape, right? And this also promotes governments themselves and politicians to want to do that, right? Because what actually happens, and this is an analysis that we wanted to show why this will happen, right? Because most revolutions happen when society and the normal citizens themselves are in need of the basic rights that you have, right? What they are doing is they're allowing that right to continue being able to be done, right? What we don't want to do is to continue enforcing that person, right? Because when politicians are afraid that they're going to get elected out due to the fact that society isn't getting what they want, they need to change their policies to ensure that maybe, you know, we can get it from the UN. And this is why their points don't stand in this debate, right? Okay, so going to my first level analysis on this, right? How you reinforce the idea that gays should be a part of society, right? So yes, we totally concede that right now it seems that Uganda is very radical in the first place, right? That there is a form of patriotism to go against homosexuals, right? It's taught in their schools. It's the rhetoric that they're trying to portray, right? But the thing is, what they're doing is not allowing any form of homosexual rights to be played to even start in Uganda itself, right? Because they're not doing anything to change. But not only are they not doing anything, they're also saying that, yeah, you know, the UN doesn't really care what you're doing right now. That's why we're still allowing you to do it, right? We think that's extremely harmful. But going to how our policy is able to change what happens in Uganda in today is this, right? What happens now is that when you take away all aid, right, and we take away aid, that people are actually put into a situation where they need to demand things from the government so that they can survive, right? How this works is that governments are pressured into accepting more liberal policies so to ensure that that aid can be given towards them, right? And this proves what we're trying to prove in the first place, right? That these people have, like, politicians have to give away this type of thing and to take away their own rhetoric to ensure that these people can stay in parliament themselves, right? Why is this a good thing, right? Because you entrench the idea that the more rights that we give to homosexuals essentially means the more rights that we get for ourselves too. More freedom towards homosexuals means more aid towards us, right? So before I move on, yes, that.
So we love it if the world to love gays and hold their hand. I'm considering that Eliza already characterized the view that not even the 1/3 of the US only has accepted homosexuality. Why is this something that you want to force on Uganda or even like the US?
Because at least in the US, they're not killing, executing, going on with hands, okay? That's the thing that you need to understand. When you see it in Uganda where gays are actively being lynched and being accused to being the person that's bringing down the country, you need to understand that you need to mitigate those harms and provide a counter narrative towards that, right? So, okay, moving on, right? How this forces a change perception, right? This is extremely important because what happens now is that when these policies start to happen, right? When governments are forced to do this, right? Essentially, you allow gays to play at least a small part role in society themselves. And this starts off that naturalization that can happen in society and in Uganda itself, right? Because they are not promoting any form of naturalization, any form of discourse within society today. So what happens under our paradigm is that naturalization and discourse can happen. Because one of the things that will happen, right, when policies are enacted to get back aid, is that the more that these governments do to get that aid, right, essentially the more that these people also get, right? Because you need, okay, so now moving on to my last substantive, right, about how we legitimize, you know, other states from doing this, right? And this is also something that you need to understand that's extremely important in itself, right? Other countries as well look towards the UN as an arbiter of their rights, right? And when the UN is biased towards a certain state and goes against its own principles in understanding that yes, you know, yes, we understand where we give you aid to ensure that you have the right to maybe your food. But when you as a society actively take away the rights of other people in itself, and these are big people in society today, then you also enforce this idea on the whole of UN itself, right? Because what happens is that you also tell all the other countries out there that, you know, maybe it's okay to do this, right? And maybe it's okay to marginalize parts of this society, right? Because what happens now is that other people also look up towards the UN and think that, you know, I can continue to marginalize and these people will still give me aid. And you promote that rhetoric towards all these other people in themselves, right? What you want to do is to ensure that the marginalization of these gays is not continued, right? Because when you take away the basic, when you restrict and you put and pressure these people to find an alternative and to try to get aid from the UN, they are forced to accept the UN's principle in itself, and they will stop marginalizing gays.
We think Uganda finds solace from the fact that 36 other African countries have yet to legalize homosexuality and have yet to decriminalize homosexuality. We think they find solace in the fact that their national identity is contingent upon the fact that we don't like homosexuals. And we don't think that the threats that they try to propose will be very effective, like they said. A few rebuttals before I move on to my case, right? Number one, they said that the state will be threatened, and this is the best form of threat, because people on the ground realize that they can no longer survive and therefore pressure the government to do so. Eliza already told you how this threat was ineffective to begin with. France and US cut off the budget, which was 50%. This isn't a joke. 50% is a huge chunk of money to Uganda itself. People on the ground could no longer survive, yet they realized that it wasn't really a threat. They realized the threat came from homosexuals themselves. They realized they need to change homosexuals themselves. That was worse. When homosexuals failed to come out of the closet, and homosexuals were attempted to be changed and abused and tortured, to be changed in their sexuality to become a straight male or female under those circumstances. We think even if it's a threat, the politicians themselves already tried to change the law, already tried to lower the consequence of being a gay. But yet, individuals on the ground struck down that law. Individuals on the ground didn't believe in that. We don't see how you still change that mindset today. Secondly, okay, I know you say that now you cut off all the aid. But look, the trade-off was this. If at that point in time, they realized that money was not more important than their national identity to disrespect gays, we think that even in this situation, money would no longer be important than their national identity themselves. They would rather die a Ugandan than die someone who's be supporting a gay under those circumstances. We don't think you change the mindset. Sit down, please. Secondly, people realize that UN now supports this and legitimizes acts against homosexuality. When they provided aid to Vietnam, they didn't propagate communism, Mr. Speaker and Madam Chair. They didn't propagate the ideas that communism should be valued by everyone. We think the World Bank itself is apolitical to begin with. Its main purpose in the United Nations was to eradicate poverty. You are now detracting from the main purpose when you say you have to provide prerequisites in order to make people more liberal, when it's even a controversial issue to begin with. Because homosexuality is a subjective issue. Even US has not legalized homosexuality in all states itself. But it's a comparative, even if you say that these people will be considered as legitimizing acts against homosexuality. Which would the World Bank rather be labeled as? Someone who legitimizes acts against homosexuality, or someone who's labeled as a murderer, a killer, someone who doesn't want to sustain the life of Ugandans on the ground. We think they would rather take the act of, hey, I think we should err on the side of caution in this situation and at least sustain the life of Ugandans on the ground. We think those situations are extremely important. Then Yongxiang came out and told you how they promoted discourse under their side when politicians start to change the policy which reflects social values. Eliza told you the social values within Uganda itself is that people don't like homosexuals. Sure, in the future, when individuals are more liberal, which I'll argue my argument today, that probably you could have that policy enacted. But right now on the ground, those policies will be ineffective. The major harm, which Eliza stated, never taken down by them, is people now victimizes homosexualities. People now try to change homosexuality in order for them to get the money, in order for them to get the aid. Because the idea is this: if everyone becomes straight now, there will not need to be this law to begin with. We think that's the kind of stance that Ugandans will take, trying to force people to change their sexuality in order to get the aid under those circumstances. They never rebutted the idea that World Bank stance should be apolitical, never rebutted the idea that homosexuals will be harmful in their policy. We believe that our harms still stands. What is my substantive for today? How economic development and how this aid is necessary for liberalization. Understanding Eliza's characterization, it will be extremely hard and it will be extremely long-term for this change to actually happen. But we think that our side is the only side which can provide the change from the grassroots. What is this? How is this going to happen? Firstly, in order for aid to be effective in this country, aid has to include a few things, such as importing human resources, such as exchanging technology, exchanging cultures, exchanging education resources. This forces interaction between Uganda themselves and liberal cultures, or cultures which they may be still foreign to under these circumstances. When different people move into Uganda, when different people trade technology and ideas in Uganda themselves, Ugandans going overseas to study under this situation where we have enough welfare to provide for them, foreign universities get built in Uganda themselves. We think this is extremely beneficial because it promotes discourse on difference in values. We think this is a situation where Uganda start to see that, hey, maybe my mindset could be probably flawed. Because we understand that currently it would be hard. It's extremely long term. That's something we concede to. The individuals may be harmed in the short term, but at least our benefit will still stand. Because in order to have a grassroots change, we need to exchange culture and exchange technology. Before I move on, yes? No? No. Okay. But the flip side is this. Under their side, where there's no economic development, Uganda will probably feel extremely antagonistic towards anyone who's not aiding them, anyone who's against their stance. What will happen is this: no discourse, interaction, or trade prepositions will be formed within Uganda and all those liberal societies you wanted to argue for. Before I move on, yes.
So you characterize Uganda as a very conservative state, right? Now you are saying that you invite universities inside, you create discourse, and somehow in your utopian idea you can create them, make them accept it. Like, what are you trying to?
Exactly what I said. It's long term and it's extremely hard. But when you have an imposition policy at this point in time, where you force people on the ground to die of starvation and blame the gays, we think that's extremely harmful. We would rather these people have a grassroots change than a top-down imposition policy, which will never be effective to begin with. I took one, please sit down. Moving on, how on the flip side it will never happen? It's harder for people of liberal values now to assimilate their values with the local people in Uganda. It's very hard for them to make a positive impact upon the community because the idea of Uganda is this: you are the very individual who's not providing aid to my very country. Why should I listen to your values? At least under our side, where there's trade and there's aid given to these people will be more likely to listen to them because they'll be seen as saviors of the Uganda people. They'll be seen as individuals who are providing very life and sustaining the very life of Ugandans themselves. That's extremely important because Uganda needs the aid to sustain itself. But furthermore, there's a quid pro quo within this circumstance. I think they tried to preempt this, but they failed, right? Because Uganda now is the main peacekeeper in Somalia itself. We think the very least the UN could do is to form a quid pro quo that since you are peacekeeping in Somalia, we will at least provide you aid in this situation. We should at least allow your soldiers to remain funded under those situations and not allow your soldiers to die of hunger and to die of starvation under those circumstances. We think the quid pro quo has to exist under this circumstance for Uganda to at least be legitimized as a proper state which could be a main peacekeeping force in the African region. We think it's extremely important for side government to understand that in order for them to change the mindsets of the people, it cannot be an imposition approach. We've already told you 5 basic harms of how imposition approach always fails. Number 1, these individuals themselves will strike down the law if their mindset isn't changed. Number 2, the politicians themselves will always attempt to reflect social value, and if that change isn't within a society, it will never happen. Number 3, how people will be more likely to antagonize the gays under those circumstances, how you never change that. Number 4, how individuals on the ground will believe that being gay is self-harming itself and believe it's their fault for being gay and their fault for people starving. And number 5, how Ugandans themselves will disrespect all liberal values at the end of the day because they believe that the liberal values are the very values that are antagonizing them. We believe within this debate.
Yeah.
I, as a homosexual, will go out and hold hands with my girlfriend. I will then immediately be put to jail. So the harms that they talked about, the primary causes, are also put upon me. I have to starve in jail. Those are the rights that are taken from me as well. But secondly, when UN continuously aid Uganda, aid the state that necessarily persecutes me, that means that the UN also legitimizes the fact that I'm a criminal. Those are the things that the LGBTs on the ground face. That's why we need a direct imposition of threat towards the people, towards the political sphere of Uganda. 2 issues for today's debate. Number 1, which side brings betterment to homosexuals? Second issue, the nature of this policy and why it's justified. But firstly, my rebuttals, because Evan always very funky, he never fits in, on the idea of education. We think that they immediately contradicted themselves because their entire characterization is that LGBT, that these people will never change their ideologies towards LGBT. Then he talked about his justification is long term. We think no, his thing is that no term at all. Because even if you provide education for the people, you never affect the policy making towards the political sphere of those individuals, of the people of Uganda. Those are the kind of things that you don't change. But thirdly, why outside, why you necessarily need the kind of imposition? Because you directly tell people that those are the things that are necessary. But the second idea on economical development, we think that it's better for us because post policy, you at least make them change their policy and you force them to accept those ideas. Economical development happens on our side because there were a lot of countries that persecuted Uganda for the way they are, which means I can now get diplomatic ties from US or France who necessarily discriminated me before. That's when economical development is better for Uganda. But moving on to my issues, on which side brings the betterment to the homosexual. Their characterization is that homosexuals will get persecuted because of the harms they face. 3 responses to that. Number 1, the reason why the persecution happens is because that the state legitimizes their ideologies. Because no one in that, the state only endorses one idea, and those are the ideas that the people follow. But secondly, which means that the harms that Ugandan face will necessarily be blamed upon the state, because the state necessarily told me that this is the ideas and the views you're supposed to endorse it. But now I'm facing a threat upon it by the UN, henceforth those are the things they're going for. But thirdly, even if the president tried to change, the reason why to strive for a change wouldn't go with that was because the rest of the political sphere still legitimize it, which means that even if the president tried to strike for the gays, the policies that were still enacted within Uganda still went against the gays. Those unnecessarily means that they're still legitimizing gays as criminals. Those are the reasons why people will never go with the same. But fourthly, our side pushes against the persecution because number 1, we force them to change policies. A homosexual who was at least on our side, the campaigns that you talked about can happen better on our side. At least you allow an LGBT to be able to voice out their views within those campaigns, right? Those are the reasons and those are the means that you need to have people directly accepting that, because the LGBTs now are not necessarily in jail for something they did. But also we think that you push for change better on our side because LGBTs can also impose their views and accept and challenge other people's views, and that is when people will necessarily reaffirm their belief towards those scenarios. Right? But secondly, their idea on how homosexuals are harmed internally. Before I move on, yes.
People in Uganda are predominantly pious and predominantly Muslim. That means they would much rather sacrifice time on earth to make sure they go to heaven than time on earth and it goes down.
We don't think this will happen because if you know that you're starving, you will necessarily go with the change of policy, even though we concede that even though the policy changes, those people may still persecute them. But at least on our side, LGBTs have rights now. They can voice out. They won't go to jail. Those are the reasons. Those are the challenges and the discourse that we want. But secondly, homosexuals are harmed internally. 2 responses. Firstly, we think this assumes that our policy won't work. It will, because there are many threats and imposition that will happen to Uganda. All the political and economical and social structure that Uganda talks they wanted on Uganda will fall immediately because they don't have monetary aids towards those scenarios. That's why our policy will work. But their only response was people will hold to their view. That's extremely simplistic, right? Second level. No, it is not. We don't think it's a form of persecution individually. We think it's an empowerment because for 2 reasons. Number 1, now the UN also legitimizes me as well. So for all this time, the US has been giving aid to Uganda, which means that UN directly says that it's okay for you to put the homosexuals in jail. Those are the kind of empowerment that we want. But secondly, we also think that it's empowered immediately because at least someone is out there to fight for my rights. At least now, even though my family is starving, at least the UN said that it's just wrong for me to be in jail. Those are the situations that they're facing. But thirdly, we also don't think those harms are mutually exclusive because people within the jail are still suffering. But also, we think that the reason why the empowerment is so impactful under our side because of the visual view of pain, which means that when I visually view that my family are suffering, that's very important for me to see that because it's important for me to know what the tantamount and how paramount I am in this world, which means that I don't deserve to be in jail. My families are suffering because I'm also worth of a human. I suffered first, let them suffer as well. We think those are important for them to visualize the importance of themselves being a homosexual. But before I move on, any POIs? No. Secondly, the nature of the policy and why it's justified. They came up with this extremely discriminatory point on how primary rights and starving is not justified. And being gay is a secondary right. We don't think so for 2 reasons. Because it's not mutually exclusive. Because as in, when I'm a homosexual and I go to jail, my rights also being provoked, which means I also starve in jail and I necessarily have to face the backdoor things. Those are the kind of rights that necessarily happen within that scenario. They only wanted to protect one community. But second, this is exactly the way to enforce the change. Because I am starving right now, that's the punishment I face for all the things that I did. So the reason they cut off aid is because the punishment, that's when people challenge their views and change, necessary change, and it comes from outside. But thirdly, how we also push for the change. Because nobody wanted to starve, nobody wants to suffer. That's when people will vote because Uganda is a democratic city. People will vote to change towards those policy, right? But also, we think that the change of policy is good because we force the discourse upon people, the discourse that finally challenge for their views. So at least this time, LGBTs can voice out and interject within those discourse. We think those are things that are extremely important because once they have rights, they can necessarily have the discourse within the society. Why they're not necessarily deserving to be criminals? Because we concede that sometimes people won't change their view. Sometimes people are still going to be against LGBT. But the difference under both scenarios is that their side continues and further those harm. Our side at least allow for LGBT to come out of the sphere, come out of the shelter they've been living in. Something they talk about, not coming out of the closet. We don't think so. We think that you empower them. But finally, what we also proved to you today, that Uganda will always take upon this policy. Uganda doesn't want to be harmed structurally, politically, economically, and socially structured, right? But also, even if they don't take it, at least on our side, we push the importance of them. We empower them because the UN says that your family needs to necessarily starve because that's the empowerment and the importance you have. With all those reasons, I'm proud to propose.
The problem inside government is that they assumed when you take away food from them, when you take away money from them, that the religious values that they have, that the social values that have been ingrained for hundreds of years will somehow be overturned. Even if we accept that Uganda will accept this money, we think that that only allows for a more implicit kind of discrimination that will happen on the ground, right? Because just because they're not criminal doesn't mean that the Ugandians can't simply not hire them because they're gay, that these Ugandans can't simply push them aside in the community because they're gay, right? That kind of thing does not happen in their side. The only thing that they do is exacerbate the harm, not just for the gays, but for the entire community of Uganda. There are two questions in this debate. There are three questions in this debate today, right? Firstly, would Uganda accept this conditional aid? Secondly, right, what exactly is the role of the UN trying to force this? And thirdly, what are the repercussions in society? First question, would Uganda accept this conditional aid? Because they told us that even though we gave the example of how 50% of their budget was going to be cut and they still didn't want to back down, their response was this: when you cut 100%, their values will be diluted. We don't think so, right? Because these things are something that they are brought up with. Like the children are brought up in schools believing that the only way to go is to hate gays. They believe that their salvation is only dependent on whether or not they criminalize these gays. We told you that that when the PM, in a moment of wanting a little bit of moderation, was struck down by the people, he was told that no, you are our PM, you have to respect the national identity. This means that these people these people would rather die here on earth, okay, and go to heaven rather than live now and die in hell, right? Sure, that's not exactly a liberal value, but these people subscribe to this kind of thing, right? But in the flip side, right, instead of allowing these people to look at these LGBT communities and call them, you are the reason why I starve, you are the reason why we have no infrastructure, in the flip side, we think that at least inside opposition, maybe some of them might even sympathize, right, with these people because they recognize after a long time, just as Evan said, when there's more interaction with liberal societies, hey, why am I suppressing you when you really didn't do much to me at all? In their side, they demonize these LGBT communities because they are the reason now why people are starving. People cannot make the rational calculus, rational decision as they said, in that rather it's the politicians' fault that this is happening because it is also the people, right, who believe in these kinds of values. We don't think they'll accept this conditional aid. But let's look at another idea, right, because Deb came out with this idea that, you know, when they see the visceral harms, it'll be better, right? But even even if this we don't think that the visual harms will necessarily work, right? Because there's something like a spiritual harm which is so much more important to them, right? That's why they're willing to lay down their lives. That's why they're not willing to lay down their Ugandan identity, right? But like this leaks down into even more than just the Ugandans who hate them, right? This leaks down to even the gays who are there, because they are brought up from young believing that the urges that I started having when I was 12, the reason that my very identity, the skin that I am in and the things that I want are wrong, right? These gays themselves believe that they are bad, and when you allow them to be demonized, as you will inside government, they will also be perpetuated, right? The beliefs that they have. But let's look at the, we don't think that are receptive, right? But let's look at the second idea. Before that, yes.
At least allow for the UN to legitimize that, and they themselves feel empowered. Even though they're persecuted by people, they know that someone is fighting for them.
Look, ma'am, we can still empower them, right, from the UN when we do things like trying to extradite them to another country, like when, you know, when we took Malala to the US so that she could fight for her rights. From there, right, that's not mutually exclusive to their side. But let's at the second question, right? What is the purpose of the UN in trying to force this? Because Eliza told you from the get-go, right, that homosexuality, your identity is not very high up in the hierarchy of rights, right? We told you that hungry people don't care so much about who they love as when is their next meal coming. In which case, we think that the rights that you need to cater to is the most inherent need, right? The problem in society, in their side, is they're only willing to protect the minority, right? When they say LGBTs get hungry in prison, well, guess what? In their society, the whole damn Uganda will be hungry, right? And considering that they're going to take at least a very, very long time to accept this aid, it's too much of a short-term harm that we're not willing to sustain, right? But the idea also was this, that the UN needs to force these kinds of policies, right? But like as I said earlier on, the implicit suppression that happens there, right, does not happen. It will still happen, right? Because you're not changing the society's perception. The thing that society is thinking about now is this: we've only changed because the West has pressured us too. Considering the relationship of Uganda with the West and that kind of thing, we don't think that that necessarily means that the values will be suddenly trickled down to them, right? Especially when they believe there's an external force that is forcing them, right? Not their own national identity and the grassroots thing. Which brings me on to the third idea, right? On the idea of repercussions. Because Kenneth tried to talk to you about the top-down approach, right? How we would work. He gave us the example of Karakari, right? That's hilarious, because Karakari was an appeal from the people on the ground who didn't want to be murdered anymore for honor killings, right? Like, look, society still doesn't want it. And what we said, like when the PM wanted to moderate and they fell against that. Like, let's look at another idea of when top-down approach was tried, right? When Proposition 8 was done, when they wanted to legalize gay marriage in the US, people overturned it, right? We tell you that these top-down approaches never work for people. People never want to accept something that you impose upon them, especially when you cannot tell them that the very people who's imposing on them have accepted it themselves, right? Because like only 1/3 of the US has accepted it, and they're somehow trying to force it onto Uganda now. That's not something that can happen, right? But let's look at that second idea on how you harm the UN's principles and somehow this is bad, right? Look, but let's look at what exactly the UN's principles are, because they told us we have laws against discrimination. That's things like racism, right? Because we know for a fact that being a particular race does not mean that you are any less than another. But we don't. But like homosexuality is still a very controversial value, right, in society today, which is why it's not exactly written down there in the Court of Human Rights. You have a right to be homosexual, right? Because people are still having discourse on that, and people are still progressing towards that. And that's something that we think can never happen in their side when you only demonize these gay people, even after they are not criminals, or because their parents will talk to the children. You know, those gay children that are in your class, they're the reason why I had to starve for half a year, for a whole year, back when I was younger, right? These kind of things cannot happen, right? But let's look at the idea of forwarding acceptance, right? Why don't we think it will happen? Because we told you, right? When people, even just 50% was cut off, people went on a witch hunt for these people. They were out for their blood. They didn't care that the West wanted them to accept them. The only thing they could think about was, I'm hungry because of you, right? And that's something that we think cannot even work, right? But like, let's look at the idea that Evan brought to you on economic development, something that can only happen here, right? Because it's a long-term kind of thing, when they can have more interaction with people who are liberal, right? This is when the kind of grassroots approaches can come up, right? This is when the kind of acceptance that you want, that side government wants, can actually happen, right? With that, we're very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
three reasons why side government lost today's debate. Firstly, all their benefits would not stand in this debate if we justify one thing and one thing only, that Uganda would never accept this policy. Look, the only argument against that idea was that Ugandans would politicians would be afraid because their political structure would fail. We told you three counter reasons why this was not true, and why even if it was true, the politicians just wouldn't really care. Because number one, the people tie their national identity with homosexuality. People would rather see their politicians remain Ugandan than remain someone who betrayed their very own nationality in this circumstance. That was something that they tried to rebut but couldn't effectively rebut at the end of the day, because they couldn't disprove the idea that homosexuality at the end of the day would no longer be tied to this individual's national identity. Second reason was because that people believe that money is now secondary compared to going to hell. This was something that came out throughout our bench, but they just laughed it off and say, I would rather starve, I would rather live on earth than going to hell. That's something crazy, especially to individuals who are pious in Uganda, people who believe that hell would be a longer period of time than a life on earth. We think that these are people who would rather see themselves being saved at the end of the day than going to hell. But thirdly, that Ugandans find solace in the fact that it's a double standard, that 36 other African countries are still anti-homosexual, that US itself, who is a liberal country, has yet to recognize gays all over the country. They find solace in that, and they believe it's a double standard that UN is imposing this on them. That's why all these threats will be ineffective at the end of the day. Second reason why they lost today's debate. Their harms were neutralized when they thought the harms they portrayed to us were effectively neutralized. They portrayed to us effectively two harms. Number one, that LGBTs will be harmed under our circumstances. And number two, that UN will be legitimizing its acts against homosexuality. Firstly, we bit the bullet early on and said we considered that harms towards gays would happen in the short term, but in the long term, we will actually cultivate some prospects and avenues where these people could potentially be more liberal under those circumstances. We bit that bullet early on. But what they didn't recognize was the fact, which was this, that LGBTs under their case will be more severely harmed, LGBTs will be victimized, LGBTs will believe that it's their fault that a country is starving, it's their fault that every other individual on the ground can no longer live. We think that these are situations where individuals who are homosexual would never try to come out of the closet or be abused into being straight under those situations. We think those are harms which they never responded to at the end of the day. The only response was this, that LGBTs will be harmed on our side. We already bit the bullet to that, and we said that it will be worse under their side. But look, UN legitimizing these acts. Mr. Speaker, when UN already agreed that the World Bank's main purpose was to be apolitical within anything they do, their main priority was to eradicate poverty, why are you now changing that stance and changing the very purpose of World Bank to begin with? If you agree that World Bank has to eradicate poverty, why does it have to come with prerequisites? Eliza told you that the only circumstance where prerequisite is necessary was when it's counterintuitive, it counters the effective transfer of money. That's why we impose democracies upon certain countries, so there will be accountability measures towards transferring funds towards people on the ground. But never in any situation was these things in controversial circumstances, like legitimizing homosexuality or making people decriminalize homosexuality, especially since it's such a subjective thing, especially since it's something that countries naturally don't believe in because they're conservative and things like that. These are stances that UN will never take under those circumstances. But look, at the end of the day, it's a comparative. Would UN rather be labeled as killers and murderers, or would UN rather be labeled as someone who's legitimizing acts against a certain identity? That's the question they never really want to answer. We believe that they still paint UN as murderers and killers under their side. The last burden, or the last reason why they lost was this: never fulfilled their burden. Their only burden they set for themselves, which they didn't fulfill, was that gays will be protected under their side. All their benefits, that gays will be able to speak out, gays will be protected, gays will be able to be supported due to the laws, fail because there's no support structure system within their side. There was no one who could back these gays up. These gays were isolated individuals. These gays were individuals who neither had the backing of society, neither had the backing of politicians, who were just reluctant to accept the policy to receive aid in the first place. Those were harms they never conceded to and never rebutted to either.
It's contradictory to come up and say that after so long of giving Uganda aid, after so long of them being able to build schools and have technology, that they're still getting more and more extremists and then say, oh, you know, that aid is going to bring out education that can educate these people. And then in the third speaker come out and also tell us this, right? Oh, that education is already indoctrinating these people. Those are harmful contradictions towards their case that take down a lot of their principles themselves, right? Okay, not just three reasons why we want this debate. Okay, but there are three clash points, right? One on change, second on the principle justification that both sides gave, and also the credibility of the UN and how we on government definitely provided a better stance in this place, right? Okay, but let's look at change first. And this is the most important part in this debate, right? Who would be able to grant homosexual Ugandans at least to stop criminalizing them, right? What they said was this, like, oh, we're going to wait a really long time and we're going to continue giving them aid, right? But the thing is, this is what we've been doing for so many years already, and the progress that we are seeing is only backwards, right? The technology and education that could have been built is already built, right? And has already been coming in, right? That's the problem under their paradigm. They never responded to the case that came out under our side, right? Why have we been talking to you and why we told you that this was going to pressure governments to change, right? Because what happens now is that the people themselves are going to demand for that change, right? We do not think that everyone is going to be a martyr and die for their religion, right? We think most rational people will want to stay alive and will want to live out their lives so they can use their own principles and enjoy life, right? So what will they do is they are going to pressure politicians to change this because they understand the easiest way to get back the quality of life that they have is to just stop criminalizing these gays, right? So we succeed in giving them and giving these gays the possibility to actually live and not be persecuted by them, right? And okay, another reason why they never responded to us, which is very interesting in this sense, right, was that they tried to portray to you that we were actually going to harm gays even more, right? That gays will stay in the closet in themselves, right? But we don't think that this actually worked, and there were a few responses to that, right? One, we told you that if there was no one standing up for the gays themselves, that no one would actually want to stand up for them, right? Because you need to have someone else on the outside saying that, yes, we are willing to stand up for you, and if these people continue to suppress you, that we will do something about it, right? This was something that they never responded to as well. Why is this a better characterization in this sense, right? Because they are never going to allow any form of outside help at all, right? They are just going to continue with the policies that have already failed, and we're going to try to do something more about that. Okay, now going to the second idea about the credibility of the UN, right? And this is something that's extremely important that was never responded to properly in this sense, right? Because all they said was, oh, you know, this principle isn't as important because you're harming the first rights of these people in the first place, right? And then this will make people stop following the UN, right? We think that this isn't true, right? That essentially both parties have harmed on the first principle, to your right and to your eat as well, right? But how do we promote and how do we ensure that this is better under our side, right? Because the credibility of the UN is extremely important in itself. We already told you, from Kenneth, from me, and from Deborah itself, that the UN does restrict its aid towards countries when they go against the law themselves. We told you things like Russia, right? And the UN, like Russia, they didn't give aid because Russia was going against the gays as well, right? We also told you a few other things, right? That just because when the UN doesn't stop other people from doing it, it also means that it tells all the other countries out there who might want to do it or who are already doing it that no, we are not going to stop you, right? As a body of the entire nation, you need to understand that you need to step your foot down as well, and we are going to do that. Because if you don't do this, what will happen is that people can get away with the marginalization of other people and have no repercussions. We tell you that we take this debate.
Oh, I love it. I left my bags inside the phone. I'm better than that. Everyone in this room is better than that.
Oh, that bad.
Yeah. Oh, I can hear the coolness outside. Oh, finally. In the what?
Oh, we didn't start the broadcast thing. We were all